Hi again, it's Nick Mays. Many thanks for tuning into Lecture 2. If you missed Lecture 1, I defined history and modernity. History was defined as interconnectivity, this idea that every aspect of a society combines to drive society forward, and that is how change comes about. I defined modernity as a state of being that accepts wide, extensive change with respect to material gains and one's personal freedoms over as wide a scale as possible. This definition includes aspects such as invisibility, capitalism, bureaucracy, and other components. Now, before we can move on to get to the depths of modernity, we first have to answer the question whether there has truly been change. And that's what I'd like to do in today's lecture. In fact, there's no time like now to get started. All right, let's establish that there has truly been change, undeniably been change. And at the same time, let's examine the losses and gains, because I think we'll see that the gains have been very substantial, and even the losses, as adverse as they might appear, they've probably come about for the best of reasons. Not all, but many of them. So let's start with this handsome figure here, Louis XIV. He was the most powerful king of his day, the wealthiest king of his day. He was a monarch who controlled a vast empire with holdings in Africa, in Asia, and North America, this very country that I'm speaking from, Canada. At the same time, he had a palace that did full justice to his power and wealth as the King of Kings of Europe. Versailles was just enormous in extent. It consisted of rooms that could accommodate something like 5,000 people. It had estates that ran on forever with houses of entertainment and hunting grounds and parks and fountains. Truly, truly an enormously important estate that one can visit to this day. At the same time, this King of Kings, strange to say, when you look at his personal holdings, well, those look a little run of the mill. So if you compare Louis's throne, there it is on the right, this handsome feature that probably required craftsmanship of an exceptional quality. If you compare it to the typical lazy boy that you might find in the suburban basement of any moderate income Canadian, North American, European, you realize that the King of Kings probably wasn't seated with the same degree of comfort as your run-of-the-mill citizen today. Similarly, if you actually compare the washroom facilities of Versailles with our washroom facilities today, our regular, common, no run-of-the-mill, no washroom that you find in any really middle-class apartment, house, or whatever, you understand the King of Kings was faced with much more discomfort than we were. In fact, we have reports of just how awful the marble-strewn halls of Versailles could actually smell because of the faulty plumbing and the very, very primitive plumbing facilities in place. It doesn't stop there. When you take a look at Louis's splendid bed, well, ask yourself, what would you rather sleep on? That bed that you see there on the left, or this handsome bed that you see over on the right, which probably is a little costly, but is well within the budget of any middle-class Canadian nowadays. No comfortable sleeps for the King of Kings in the way that someone today, with just a few bucks in his pocket, can easily enjoy a comfortable sleep that was way beyond the European monarchs. Then, of course, there's heating and air conditioning. The King of Kings, on a cold winter night, relied upon a fireplace and was breathing in particulate matter. And of course, the lighting had to come about through candles, as opposed to our electric lighting today. And of course, on a blustery day here in Canada, you just have to turn to this little box here, punch in the right number, and you're suddenly very comfortable. And similarly in summer, whereas the King of Kings would be sweltering in his elaborate costume on a July or August afternoon, here in Canada, we just have to make an adjustment to the very same box, and suddenly we're in a very, very pleasant climate. The King of Kings had this marvelous conveyance that could probably take him anywhere between 30 to 40 miles a day, but in extreme discomfort. In spite of the gilding and the cushions inside, The suspension would have been horrible, and the roads, of course, would have been rutted. So after a couple of hours riding in this conveyance, as fancy as it is, the King of Kings would probably suffer from backache, as opposed to your typical Canadian family that can pile into the car and drive down to Florida for the winter if they want to, in absolute comfort. Once again, if it's too cold outside, you turn up the heat. If it's too warm, you turn on the air conditioning. Amazing. And of course, as you stop, make pit stops along the way, you've got food and washroom facilities and accommodations that could perfectly house you, as opposed to the King of Kings, where one doesn't even want to imagine what happens when nature calls. Sorry about that. Then there's the entertainment. The King of Kings put on one spectacle after the next, bringing in the prize musicians and playwrights of the day to entertain these vast crowds that would hang upon his every word and gesture. The problem is that as soon as the performance ended, well, that's it. If you had that tune struggling in your head, you'd have to call the orchestra back, which Louis could have done, it's true, it's some inconvenience, and then you would have the whole piece put on once again. But this is so unlike us today, where we can just turn on Netflix or Spotify and we can listen to that song, or we can watch that TV show, or watch that brilliant movie production again and again and again, whenever we like, and as many times as we like. And then, of course, so far we haven't really talked about Louis's person. Louis suffered from dreadful headaches, probably because he was absorbing particulate matter and he had problems with his eyesight. More about that in just a moment. Unlike us, where we can reach for Advil or Tylenol or aspirin or materials that are even more powerful than the ones I just listed, he was reliant on herbal remedies to cure his migraines. And then, of course, Louis, who had terrible teeth, he would have to rely upon the dentists of his day. And there was very, very, very little they could actually do for him, as opposed to our setup these days, where we can visit a dentist and within a matter of an hour or so, we can actually have our problem set straight. Louis had to rely on primitive spectacles that were only so effective and no more. Unlike us, where we have bifocals or we have sunglasses, prescription sunglasses even, and if we care to have our vision fixed, well, we can actually turn to laser surgery, and such things as cataracts, as well as near or farsightedness is corrected within a matter of an hour or so. Right? And once again, all of this is within the means of our typical citizen. These are not holdings that only the wealthiest of people can afford. The Steve Jobs or Bill Gates of this world. These are items that we have ready access to. Louis' shoes. Let me just step away from the famous portrait. We have a close-up on these elegant red high heels, which Louis wore and which must have cost a fortune and were only really made through great craftsmanship once again. But one has to wonder whether those shoes were nearly as comfortable as these shoes, Nikes, which are easily affordable by, once again, any normal Canadian, any normal American, any normal European. These shoes provide huge comfort to our feet, as opposed to those ridiculously priced and somewhat ridiculous looking shoes that Louis himself was wearing on a regular basis. Simple things. Did Louis ever help himself to a handful of cashews? Did he ever taste a kiwi? Did he ever have a banana split? No ice cream for the King of Kings, no bananas likely for the King of Kings. Did he ever wolf down a plate of sushi? These simple pleasures, which again are easily affordable for your typical Canadian, North American, these were just not available for the king to enjoy. Simple things too, such as the height off the ground that he was able to get. So maybe Louis climbed the towers of Notre Dame, which existed in his day, in those clumsy red high heels of his. But did he ever get as high as one could climb today on the Eiffel Tower or on Toronto's CN Tower? Did he ever see the world from an especially large height? And of course, the answer is no. Did he ever fly in a plane and view the world from 70,000 feet? Absolutely not. These are pleasures that cost a little more for the typical Canadian or North American, but they are eminently affordable and they give us a perspective that the King of Kings never had. And then just from a point of view of knowledge, the King of Kings knew a lot about Europe because his armies were constantly invading different corners of it. But he did not know nearly as much as we could pick up on with the simple purchase of the CIA World Factbook. This would tell us huge amounts of information that the King of Kings simply would not have been privy to. And again, this is something that is affordable within the reach of your typical North American. Let's just talk about progress. We see how much progress has been made in the age of Louis. Let's just talk a little bit about progress now. So just to give you some sense of timescale, from the amount of time it took us from the invention of our earliest stone tools and weapons to the creation of our metal tools and weapons, we're looking at a period of roughly 2.5 million to 3 million years. However, when you take a look at the development of our metal tools and weapons to the creation of Watson, that brilliant machine that beat Ken Jennings at Jeopardy, you're now looking at a period of approximately 3,000 years. 3,000 years. Right? This is really quite extraordinary. Perhaps another way of putting this is to think of the artist Henri Matisse. In the year that he was born, 1869, the strongest weapon in the world was one of these ironclads. This had an engine, but it also had sail power. It could go circumnavigate the world perhaps in 8 weeks. It had 40 cannonry on it, so that if it parked itself alongside a port and let go, it could do a great deal of damage to any party that was unwilling to cooperate with British imperial policy. So really quite a formidable engine of war. The only thing is that the year in which Henri Matisse died, 1954, we had the first testing of the hydrogen bomb. In the space of one man, you move from one engine of war that can do serious damage to a local city to a weapon of war that can wipe whole cities off the face of the earth. But let's think of this from a more personal perspective. Let's think of one generation today, really my generation. So what we see here is a picture in 1954 of a typical Torontonian crowd that has come to celebrate the inauguration of the Toronto subway system. So there they are, right? This typical, really sort of a random selection of individuals living in Toronto of the day. Here is a typical random selection of individuals in the present day. They're going to ride the Toronto subway system. Very, very different crowd, as you can see. The Toronto of 2023 is, as you see on the left, and that compares to the Toronto of the 1950s over on the right. And what's interesting is just to compare the Toronto of the 1950s with the Toronto of 1900. As you can see, it has barely changed. But when you move forward from the 1950s to 2023, we see remarkable change. The Toronto of 1950s, it consisted of a population of 1.2 million, and then its surrounding area, the Greater Toronto area, it was 1.4 million. So you had roughly 200,000 people living on the periphery of the city. Of the population living within Toronto, 6% belonged to visible minorities. So you would have had a few blacks, a few Sikhs, a few Asians, but by far the majority were not just whites, but these were whites who were of Anglo-Scots descent. In the Toronto of today, you've got 2.9 million people living in Toronto, but the GTA now claims some 7 million people. So we've moved out to the suburbs to a very significant degree. At the same time, within Toronto itself, you've got 60% of the population that belongs to a visible minority. That's from 6% to 60% within the space of approximately 60 years. 12.3% of that population now consists of people of Anglo-Scots descent. Interestingly enough, 12.5% of the population are people of ethnic Chinese descent. So the Anglo-Scots are not even the largest minority in town any longer. Toronto is now home to approximately 175 languages. It is a linguist's dream. So this is very significant demographic change. We could also just look at the wider context of Canada. In Canada of the 1950s, you had 15.5 million people, 7.5 million of Anglo descent, another 7 million Europeans, Ukrainians, and Italians, and Frenchmen, etc., and some 500,000 people all in all of Indigenous descent, Asian descent, Black descent. As opposed to Canada today, notice how the flag has changed. Right? We've got 39 people living within our borders, and some 32% of them are are visible minorities. So by 2050, the projection is the population will be a minority white population. So this too is a very, very significant development. Not alarming, this is purely descriptive. So what's also interesting about the 1950s population inaugurating the subway, and the present day population that is riding the subway is the notion of devices. So your typical crowd, as you noticed in that scene from 2024 on the subway, they're holding on to this device here. In order to have the power that this device has, the 1950s crowd, if they wanted to make a call, would have to get off the subway and make a call on the closest payphone. Right? If they wanted to listen to music, then they would have to either go to a concert or they would have to go home and listen to their stereo. If they wanted to watch a movie or a TV show, right, and there's the TV of the day, they would actually have to go home and either turn on their TV, or they would have to make their way to a cinema and pay the admission price and go in and see the movie on display. And of course, in this instance, as you can see, there is just one movie taking place at this cinema, as opposed to the dozens and if not hundreds of movies that they can choose to watch from the comfort of their subway seat. And then, of course, if they wanted to read a text, well, they would actually, in the 1950s crowd, would actually have to go to a library and take the book out, or go to a bookstore and purchase it, as opposed to the present day crowd who can just download this. Is this a significant change? I think we can all agree that it is highly significant. There's also the nature of work. Here we see an encyclopedia salesman. Huh? What's an encyclopedia salesman? What's an encyclopedia? Right? We've got Wikipedia. Who has encyclopedias today? And yet this man is going door to door to sell them. It wasn't a great job, but it was a common job in the 1950s. Then you've got typesetters. These are the individuals who are setting up the type for that day's newspaper. This does not involve any type of human labor any longer. And then, of course, you've got this individual who is a projectionist. If you were to watch a movie, you would sit in the cinema and this individual would start the film rolling. His job is absolutely gone from the scene. And then this woman here, many people on the subway in the 1950s would be traveling to work so they could work as telephone operators. This woman has long been out of a job. This no longer happens by hand. Instead, we've got algorithms that would look after this. And this man, I remember this. We actually had a man who came by every day and delivered milk to us, right? Stopping off at the house and coming out of his truck and dropping however many bottles of milk we wanted. Job has long disappeared. Common in the 1950s, it has now disappeared. At the same time, we have the people on the contemporary subway train who are working at jobs that the people in the 1950s have never heard of. Doctor they've heard of, accountant they've heard of, but ultrasound technician, they don't know what this is. Job has not yet come about. And then, of course, you've got this individual here who is a drone pilot, commandeering drones. Again, this would just strike the 1950s crowd as a scene from science fiction. Software engineers and security experts, right, involving encryption and whatnot. These jobs are simply not on the radar screen of the 1950s. And then it's also a question of the place of work. Right? The individual on the left has to go to his office where he has his importance to shuffle about. No doubt he's a very important person, as opposed to this person on the right who is on the subway, and it could be that he's reading a book or watching a film or playing a game, but he could also be doing work. He's got all of his files on his phone, and it could be that he's actually off for some type of entertainment because he did his work at home that day. Have things changed? Absolutely. On the 1950s train, if you were riding it, you might see that some young woman is reading the old Jules Verne classic, From the Earth to the Moon, right? And you'd be thinking, wow, that's an intriguing piece of science fiction. But if you're on the 2024 train, you might overhear a young woman say to her partner, I can't believe it's been 50 years since we've put a man on the moon. And that was 50 years ago. Have things changed? You bet they have. If you're on the train, you might hear these various people talking about stock tips. Maybe they should invest in US Steel or General Motors or Ford. These would have been the big companies of the day. They would know nothing of such companies such as Apple and Tesla and Nvidia and Meta and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing is that when you compare Ford today, which has it's a company that makes things, it's got infrastructure, it has large factories, and it has metal coming in, which it smooths into cars, which pass along its assembly lines, et cetera, et cetera. It's got all this stuff in place. When you compare its market capitalization to Meta, or formerly Facebook, which deals in information, Meta has a market capitalization that is close to 100 times that of Ford. This is just astounding. And of course, if you were going to take any of those people giving you stock tips about US Steel and General Motors and Ford, etc., you would phone your stockbroker, who would place an order down to the stock exchange, where the order would finally go through, perhaps by the end of the day. Unlike this gentleman again, who we thought he might be reading a book or might be looking through his work files, but perhaps he was actually trading stocks from the comfort of his seat. Yes, it really is that easy today. It could be that some of the people on the train of the 1950s are off to see the doctor. One of the most advanced devices, one invented in 1958, that they might have encountered had they actually needed it, would be the pacemaker. This was considered to be a marvelous breakthrough. Of course, that's nothing like our breakthroughs today, where if you have a problem with your heart, you can avail yourself of the pacemaker, but there's also the possibility of having stents installed. And then, of course, we also have something known as in vitro fertilization. And then we have CRISPR, which can actually alter or edit our genetic code, which we've been able to map through the likes of the Human Genome System. And then over here, for diagnosis purposes, right, you can have a CAT scan or an MRI, which is a big improvement, a much bigger improvement on the X-rays of the 1950s. And with these breakthroughs, is it any wonder that here in Canada, and the statistics would pretty much be the same in the United States and Europe and the Western world as a whole, right, that life expectancy for men has jumped from 67 back in 1958 to 80 today, and for women it's gone from 73 to 83. 13 additional years of life for men and 10 additional years of life for women. And wait, here in Canada too, in the 1950s, when you saw the doctor, you would get a bill at the end of your visit. Today, all you need to do is show your health card, and you walk away without having paid a cent. Of course, you pay through your taxes, but our understanding is that the healthcare system is there for everyone, and that the levels in your pocketbook or in your wallet or in your bank account will not determine the degree of care that you actually receive. If you were off to see a professional of some type, not just a doctor, but perhaps a dentist or a lawyer or an accountant back in the 1950s, well, chances are you would encounter men who were filling these roles. White men at that. As opposed to today, where we would not be shocked at all to discover that the lawyer handling our affairs is female, right? Or from an ethnic minority, or that the doctor who's going to be looking after us is a female or member of an ethnic minority. And the same would be true of the accountant and dentist and other such professionals. The world has absolutely changed in this domain. In fact, here is a picture of the graduating class from Harvard Law School from 1958. And here we see that they are all white men, white males, as opposed to the graduating class of 2023, just last June. And here we see that it is a wide array of people, right? Not just men and women, but people who perhaps might be gay, people who might be transgendering, people who are Black, people who are Asian, and so on and so forth. Anyone can go if they've got the right stuff, and they can hang out their shingle and practice the law and make very, very good money in the process. Here's a picture of the faculty members, some of the faculty members of the U of T Medical School back in the 1950s. Again, all white males. And here's a partial list. I really just chose this at random. A partial list of the faculty members at the University of Toronto Medical School today. Dr. Abadir, Dr. Abdalian, Dr. Abdel Kadir, and so on and so forth. As you can see, these are not white male Christian males any longer. What we've told ourselves is if you've got the wherewithal to get into medical school, whether you are Muslim or black or white or female or whatever, welcome aboard. And this shows you that you can see it in the picture here. Here you've got a number of students, senior students at U of T's medical faculty, sitting in on a meeting, and once again they come from a wide variety of backgrounds. If in the 1950s you were on the train and you were off to see a doctor, but you had the idea of actually having an abortion, well, guess what? That's against the law. You're not going to see a doctor who's actually going to perform this procedure. In fact, you could probably end up in prison if you wanted to get this type of procedure actually done upon you. As opposed to today, where you go to something like a Morgentaler clinic and you tell the physician that you really would like to end your pregnancy, and it happens very quickly at public expense. This procedure too is covered by our medical system. And this would be true of divorce, right? When you actually look at the chart on the left, you see the number of divorces and the number of marriages and divorces that took place from 1921 into the present day. And you see that with respect to marriages, you have a great deal of marriages. That's the upper curve, right? They just keep growing, of course, because of the expanding population. But when you actually take a look at the number of divorces, it is almost a flat line until you hit the 1960s when the divorce laws changed. So if you were in an unhappy marriage in the 1950s here in Canada, and the same would apply to the United States and Europe, the chances are it would be very, very difficult to disentangle yourself from this romantic attachment. And then, I mean, imagine approaching that 1950s crowd that is gathered to inaugurate the Toronto subway system and going up to an individual and just saying, "Excuse me, sir, would you be a homosexual by any chance?" This man, even if he did have tendencies in that direction, he would punch you in the face. Punch you in the face. And because if he let this out, it could be that he would be subject to scrutiny. On the right, what we see is something that was called the fruit machine, a dreadful phrase, but that's what it was called. And this machine was designed to measure usually men's reaction to homosexual pornography to determine whether they were attracted to men or not. And in the event that they passed this test with flying colors, that is to say they were attracted to this pornography, they could be deprived employment in choice positions, or who knows, they ran the risk of being arrested. As opposed to that contemporary subway crowd who on a bright sunny day in the summer, they might be off to the Toronto Gay Pride March, where some 2.3 million people gather openly in public and just march in favor of this, proudly, of this new identity of theirs. In fact, in the city of Toronto, 18% of the population readily identify as gay, right? From a population where no one would admit this in the 1950s, we've moved to a population where 18% of the population would openly declare this with absolutely no recriminations whatsoever. If you were to deny such a person housing or schooling or employment based on their sexual identity, you would run in trouble with the law. And of course, we can see why this is the case. The law has changed because Parliament has changed. In the Parliament of the 1950s, there were 11 women sitting in the House of Commons and the Senate combined, out of a collection of approximately 337 members. They were an absolute minority. At the same time, there were no members of any visible minority sitting in either the House of Commons or the Senate, as opposed to today, where approximately 20% of the population, maybe 25% of the population sitting in the House of Commons is of an ethnic descent, and some third of the parliamentarians are women, and half the present-day Trudeau cabinet is female as well, with a large smattering of members from visible minorities, in addition. So this, and of course, when you have such people sitting in government and debating the law, these are people who are going to change the law in such a way whereby it is more accommodating for women and ethnic minorities rather than throwing the old obstacles in their path. Perhaps it's a Sunday and that 1950s crowd is off to church or coming from church, which is what the majority of Torontonians would have done on that day. They certainly would not have gone to a restaurant or a bar because these things were closed. They couldn't have gone to see a movie or a theater because they too were closed. Toronto was strictly ran according to very strict operation lines at the time, as opposed to the crowd today where perhaps some of them are going home to a church that has been turned into condominiums because so few people actually attend church services in this brave new era of ours. And they perhaps are going home rather than actually going to see a movie or a play because they realize they can just surf the web on their phone or their laptop and watch any movie of their choice, right, or any TV show of their choice from the comforts of home. And speaking of entertainment, if you were to go home in the 1950s and you were to watch a television show, what type of television would you actually see? Well, you might see The Honeymooners, you might see The Lone Ranger, you might see Gunsmoke, you might see Andy Griffith, right? All of these were shows that were running at the time. The only problem is that if you were going to see the show, then you would have to make sure that you actually got there at the right time, because if you didn't see it, it would be gone. Maybe it will be rerun maybe a year or 3 years later, but you don't see it, that's it. Too bad, you missed your chance, right? And what's also interesting about these shows is that the main hero is almost always a white male. And the show itself reinforces the white collective values of the day, where it's very, very clear the white man is in control. He is playing the heroic role. You've got women, supporting women in the background, busy cooking roasts and keeping the house. And then here and there, you've got an appreciative sidekick from an ethnic minority who is perhaps helping out the male white hero, but not in a way whereby he's going to in any way upstage the white male hero. And everybody is so happy to be part of this, ostensibly happy to be part of this type of society, as opposed to today, when of course you can not only watch these shows on Netflix, right? And we don't have major studios making such shows any longer. Sometimes they do, but sometimes we don't. Instead, we have private enterprise making them. And if you watch it tonight or tomorrow or the next day, you want to watch it 10 times over in a row, knock yourself out. And what's so interesting about these shows, in the case of The Bear and Beef and I'm a Virgo and a huge number of other offerings, there is a deeply multi-ethnic cast. Very often they are the heroes of the show. Their values, right, are their values, and they don't necessarily have to tie into the values of the traditional white society that presided over everything some time ago. Instead, they can follow their own trajectory. And very often when you do have shows, such as in The White Lotus, where you have a predominantly white cast of characters, very often the white characters are shown to be deeply spoiled, right, deeply privileged, and highly problematic. So that far from reinforcing the old traditional values, what we actually see is either a parallel set of values that have thrust them to one side, or those old traditional values, when they do surface today, they are brought under very, very strict criticism. And this isn't true of Canada, right? I could have shown you a picture of a mass gathering for the Paris subway, or for the Washington subway, or for the London subway, or for the Roman subway, and so on and so forth. This type of change, where we have greater rights for ethnic minorities, greater rights for gay couples, greater rights for women, this is spread comprehensively across the West. So Canada is far from unique in this regard. Now here is perhaps a contentious but an interesting and I think very substantial point. When we think of that male, white, heterosexual, ostensibly Christian population back in the 1950s, there they are on the left. These men hold all the power. Some of them are weak, to be sure, but they are part of the demographic that holds all the power. And when we compare them to white men today, right, who are ostensibly heterosexual, but white and male and post-Christian, these men have much less power than they did before. When it comes to being employed, the men on the the men on the right, the men of today, they can't just assume for the sake of argument that because they come from a Christian past, and because they're white, and because they're male, and because they are, on, superficially speaking at least, heterosexual, they can't assume that the job is theirs. They don't have any advantage any longer over other people when it comes to getting into choice programs, choice employment, choice housing, and so on and so forth. In other words, when we take a look at a graph of white male power, we understand it is sunk to a very, very significant degree. It is not zero. You still see white male influence in the boardroom and in government, but these vestiges of power are very much going to decline over time as well. And it's an interesting thing. What do we call it when we actually have a shift in power from one group to another? We generally speaking call this a revolution. When power is transferred from one leading group and is spread over, right, the masses of a second group, we would understand that something revolutionary has happened. And of course, revolutions can be very, very violent, as in the guise of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, or they can be a little more, right, a little more peaceful when you have the new pushing out the old. It can be a much more gentle process, more of an evolutionary process, but revolutionary nonetheless, because that change in power has been very, very real and very, very substantial. And that's exactly what happened from, let's say, the 1950s into the present day. Those men in charge, those men in the picture of 1954 in Toronto, right, those are men who decided that they were going to actually slacken their reins, right, slacken their hands on the reins of power. These reins were not taken from their hands. They were not defeated. They went about this voluntarily. Now, I by no means wish to in any way dismiss the enormous amount of courage it took for people like Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks or Betty Friedan or a Harvey Milk to come into the public sphere and argue for the rights of blacks, for the rights of gay people, and the rights of women. There were times when these people were spat upon, when they were threatened, and of course, Martin Luther King and Harvey Milk, both of them were assassinated. So yes, they did this at great risk to themselves. But the fact of the matter is that the men they were addressing, the white, heterosexual, Christian men they were addressing and asking from whom they were asking a greater share of the pie, these were men who didn't have to give that share of the pie if they didn't want to. These are men who controlled the media. These are men who controlled the courts. These are men who controlled the professions. They controlled the economy. They controlled the military. They controlled the police. They controlled the law. They controlled everything, everything. And therefore, if their primary purpose had been to hand on power from themselves to their sons, to their white, heterosexual, male, right, Christian sons, they could have done it. They had all the means to do so, but they didn't. They didn't. Not because they were kinder than earlier generations of white, heterosexual Christian men, but because it was a calculated loss and a calculated gain. They lost exclusive access to top schools, lost control of the professions, lost control to some degree of the courts and of government and of other primary features of our world, the culture, etc. They lost all of this, but at the same time, they made staggering gains. They too suddenly, right, because they actually relinquished these reins of power, over time they came to live longer lives. You suddenly had a huge amount of brain power operating within the economy. These brilliant members of the ethnic minorities and brilliant women who were going to go on to improve by leaps and bounds the quality of our medical system, which these white men would gain from. They had now too, like women, had the freedom to divorce. It wasn't only women who were caught in these desperately unhappy marriages. It was true of white men too, and they were so happy to see this type of change come about. They were free. They were freed from the burden of faith, of attending a church or a shul every week if they didn't want to. This was something they no longer had to do because of this revolutionary change. And they were just as glad for it as were people who had always been left off to one side. They too had free sexual choices. Perhaps the woman didn't want this pregnancy any more than the male did. And the male and woman together, right, could actually terminate this pregnancy that would have caused them so much grief. At the same time, if a man today is homosexual, he has ready access to like-minded people in a way that he did not some 50, 60 years ago. There are fewer class structures in place. You no longer have upper class twits pushing not only women and visible minorities around, but white men as well. Therefore, we don't have to march off to war at the behest of these individuals, and we don't have to live by the terrible financial decisions that these people are making, our governmental decisions that they're making. At the same time, this present day class of white men whose fathers and grandfathers were formerly in control, they can tell themselves that they live with greater common decency because they can actually allow people who really are owed a chance, owed some type of place in the common space. They can actually give this to them. There's no question any longer that when you walk in public and you wonder who that woman is, or who that black man is, or who that Asian is, there's no question any longer that you can tell yourself, well, he certainly isn't a doctor and she certainly isn't an accountant, right? The opportunity that has been brought about is just staggering. And this too is a gain that men of my age and younger, white men of my age and younger, happily buy into, in spite of the fact that I don't enjoy nearly as much power as my grandfather would have, or even my father would have. The world has changed. I've lost this power and status, but I've gained immeasurably from it. And this is very important to keep in place, right? This is not something that was forced at gunpoint. It came about through this voluntary process on the part of the people who formerly had power, because they understood that this would be a tide that would raise all ships. We have changed on all fronts, tech and health and wealth, as we've seen, but also with respect to our moral assumptions. This is hard to swallow because, generally speaking, we're thinking that morality is there for all time, that when you're speaking of Torah, the old Hebrew Bible, or you're speaking of the New Testament, or you're speaking of the Quran, what is written in those books is good for all time, and that there isn't anything that we do, right or wrong, that isn't listed in these books. And therefore, if you follow the prescription of these ancient texts, you are behaving in a morally sound fashion. Well, in actual fact, we've made huge gains because we have eliminated capital punishment in so many different parts of the West. We have come to accept the other and banish such things of slavery, it goes without saying, but we've come to accept the other, the idea being that if you're Christian and you're navigating a space, the same space as a Jew or Muslim, it makes no difference in the eyes of the law. You are entitled to nothing more than these other people are. That's not something that would wash very well with these formal moral texts. We treat women with greater respect. We treat animals with greater respect. We don't punish our children using corporal means any longer. If this happened in 1950, you were slapping your kid because they hadn't done something that was appropriate, right? People would have said, well, yeah, he'll know better next time. If you were to do that now in public, you would have a dozen people stopping and saying, that's not how we treat children. In other words, you'll remember that I described modernity as a state of being, or a consciousness of endless change. Well, to some degree, that consciousness is what we see at work here when we talk about this moral change. We now have a new consciousness that makes us aware of the fact that you cannot treat women as we did in the past, or members of visible minorities, or children, or your neighbor, and so on and so forth. In other words, our moral code is, to a very significant degree, not entirely, but to a significant degree, it is circumstantial. So why don't we just take a look at this with respect to women's rights? Let's just run with this idea and show how it really is a product of circumstance. Right? When one talks about ancient Athens, the picture that you see on the right here, it is one of the world's first democracies, but a critic could quite reasonably say, well, how much of a democracy was it, given the fact that women didn't have the right to vote, right? That's not a democracy. That type of assertion probably is the equivalent of inserting a Starbucks cup into a setting and expecting everything to run smoothly. That assertion that it wasn't a democracy because women didn't vote is a violation of all the norms of Athenian society at that time. As we can see, if we ask ourselves, what had to come into play so that women finally, in places like Canada and the United States and Europe, could finally win the vote for themselves. So first off, the whole idea of voting, once it died out in classical no, in classical times, right, with the collapse of Rome and the collapse of the Greek way of life, once that ended, democracy died. We had monarchies and empires, but no sign of democracy pretty much anywhere. So first, in order to actually have democracy take root and women voting, you would have to have a consciousness of the importance of elections arising once again, which started in the late 17th and early 18th centuries and gradually gained some degree of steam. At the same time, there would have to be an awareness that it's not just men who would have the right to vote. In fact, not just propertied men who would have the right to vote. In fact, not just white propertied men who would have the right to vote, but you would have to include, at the very least, women in that equation as well. The only problem is that of all those thinkers you see gathered in that salon over there on the right, none of them actually thought of granting voting rights to women, except one French thinker by the name of Condorcet, and he was pretty much laughed out of the room. Right? Even Mary Wollstonecraft, who was an early proponent and very brave proponent for women's equality in the 19th century, it never occurred to her that women should have the right to vote. She thought women should be treated as the intellectual equals of men and that they should be entitled to education along the lines of men. But at the same time, she, in some ways, didn't really have the breadth of vision to demand that women would actually have a public role in society and therefore they should have the right to vote in the way that men do. It didn't occur to her. She thought they'll get their education, but they'll still be part of the private space and not the public space. At the same time, you would also need a shift from the age of muscle, right, to the age of the machine. In a world in which ultimately your food source, your sources of food and your common defense rely upon the brawn, heavy brawn, in order to succeed, this means the world is going to be heavily weighted to the advantage of men. But as soon as you move into the age of the machine, where suddenly you have a great deal of importance placed upon the intellect of the individual, well, this is opening a door for women to take advantage of over time. So you would need industrialization to kick in order for women's rights to come about, just as you need a discussion about elections in general to come about in order for women to have the right to vote. All right, another consideration is the fact that sometimes rights in one quarter give rise to rights in another. So in the case of Susan B. Anthony, who was a champion of women's suffrage at a later stage in her career, she first came to realize this issue of suffrage because she had worked on the issue of slavery. She herself was from a Quaker family, was appalled by the fact that slavery was still in existence in the United States, worked to reverse that. And when she was successful in the aftermath of the Civil War, was amazed that the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were passed. The 13th Amendment granted the Black population its freedom. The 14th Amendment granted them their citizenship. And the 15th Amendment, on a federal level at least, granted Black males the right to vote. However, Susan B. Anthony was thinking, if the Black man is able to vote, why shouldn't the woman be able to vote? So it's very interesting. In addition to the fact that you really needed the idea of elections coming into play, and you also needed this transition from the age of farming and muscle to the age of industrialization and brain power, more or less, you also needed at the same time, and you needed, of course, this huge enlightenment as well. You also needed this understanding that rights in one quarter would inevitably translate into rights in a second quarter. That too wasn't enough. You needed a massive war in which huge numbers of men would participate and would leave all sorts of gaps back home in the economy, which women would fill. I'm talking, of course, about the First World War. You had millions of men walking off or marching off to war, and women had to keep the means of production going, as well as the food supplies going. And they stood up to the plate magnificently and showed society that they were capable of doing the work of men. As a result, when the war came to an end, we had the Reform Act of 1918 in England that granted women the vote. We had a change of legislation in Canada in 1917 that granted women the vote. And of course, there's the 19th Amendment in the United States in 1919 that granted women the vote. And this was true of other European countries as well. So this too was a necessary ingredient in the step towards women's emancipation. Even then, you also needed another factor. You had to ensure that Christian stricture did not contradict the type of the type of freedom that women were now fighting for within the public space. So to some degree, you needed some of the traditional strictures of Christianity to be dialed back so that women could finally win a more equitable place in the sun. And even that wasn't enough. Women had to control the means of their production. This could come about through abortion, a change to the abortion laws, in which case you would need more women passing through universities and then moving into houses of parliament where they could actually get such laws changed. But at the same time, you could also have something of a shortcut through the development of contraceptives like the pill in the 1950s that now put women in a position where they did not necessarily have to suffer from unwanted pregnancies. Right? So that too was a necessary step if we were going to see the full emancipation of women take place. All right. At the same time, um, we also had to have, my apologies, we also had to have the appearance of labor-saving devices. It wasn't enough for a woman to have control of her reproduction, to be attending university, and to have the right to vote if she was going to gain full emancipation. If she wanted to start a family, very often she would have to be freed of the domestic labor involved if she was going to actually actively participate in the workforce. And therefore, we had to wait for the appearance of such things as washing machines and vacuum cleaners for the right pieces to come into play. So in a sense, you could only really have this full switch to women's emancipation and a gradual burgeoning change of consciousness on the part of men who had subjected them to a secondary status all this while. It could only come about when all the right pieces fell into place. It seems something of a preposterous assumption that this isn't a good in its own right. I mean, it stands to reason that women should have the right to vote and they should have equal access to the public space as men do. But in making such an assertion, all one is really saying is, I am of a generation where I see these rights as being transparent because my consciousness has changed. That is not transparent at all, no, by any means whatsoever, when you go back to pre-modern eras where the right ducks had not been lined up in the row, and therefore women were forced into this secondary status. So all of this means, in other words, that not only have we witnessed change over the last generation or so, my lifetime, we've not only seen change on the technological front, as well as on a cultural front and a religious front, but we've seen it on a moral front as well. We have seen our consciousness change with respect to the well-being of others. It is this remarkable evolution or step forward that has brought about a change of regard of that formerly dominant white heterosexual Christian male, right? A change of consciousness that allows for greater well-being and power and status of other groups beyond his own divisions. This is truly, truly extraordinary. So I've been making the argument that we've had all these magnificent changes, but someone could easily come up with the counter argument that maybe the changes haven't been all that great. They brought about a lot of chaos in their wake. So, for example, for sure we've seen an improvement in civil rights and tech and diversity and freedom and so on and so forth. Right? This, it seems to me, is incontrovertible. I think if you're going to make the argument that simply isn't the case, as I think I told you in the last lecture, my students would occasionally make, or as we see various representatives make, that simply is wrong. It is simply wrong. But at the same time, what we have seen is the appearance of other problems, such as income disparity. It has never been as great as it is at present, unless you're going back to the Gilded Age in the end of century America, 19th century America. We have seen plenty of wars outside the West. We might have had peace, from the end of 1945 until the present day in the West, But there have been plenty of wars that have taken place outside the Western Hemisphere, in Vietnam and in Iraq and in Sudan and in Cambodia and so on and so forth. At the same time, we do see lingering racism and sexism. That when I say that human rights have changed, that is not to say that we don't see instances in which women and visible minorities are treated very harshly. We have an environmental crisis. It seems to me it is almost, no, it is foolishly stubborn to deny that this is the case. And then, of course, we have a great deal of alienation and homelessness in our midst. And of course, a new problem, and let me just turn away here, we have the abuse of social media. Right? We are now living in a realm where anonymous people can take the stripe out of honest players and perhaps even alter election results from the comfort of their home. Right? We can bully, we can interfere in undue manners now in a way that we couldn't before. So we've got all these gains from the 1950s and on, but they've been accompanied by losses. What are we to make of these things? Well, I think we can separate these losses into a number of different categories as a way of unquestionably acknowledging them, but at the same time to remove some of their sting. So let's just imagine that point where cars were coming onto the road in, let's say, the early 1900s. And there was this brief moment where cars and horses actually shared the road. There yet hadn't yet developed that stage where cars had completely supplanted horses, even in cityscapes. And therefore, there was this very brief period where the two could be seen operating simultaneously. And similarly, when the cell phone revolution started, there you still can occasionally come across a payphone, and there are people who still have rotary phones. But of course, we understand that these things will gradually be phased out of the equation. In the same way, there are people who listen to stereos and records and CDs. But we understand that over time, unless you're looking at someone who is a real audiophile, that is a technology that has just been superseded, and typewriters and the like. What I'm saying is that there are always residual effects. When you have a modern invention that comes into play, there's a period of time where there's an overlap with the old technology that people had been using for considerable periods of time. And then gradually, over time, the old technology pushes out, no, is pushed out by the new technology. But the same is true of attitudes. When we think of what happened to poor George Floyd when he was murdered by Derek Chauvin, we understand that this type of attitude is still there. It's still possible to hear racial epithets thrown about. But generally speaking, this is an attitude that adheres to older populations that haven't yet quite adjusted to the new realities of this new consciousness of ours. And over time, we will gradually see instances of abuse, like poor George Floyd, gradually fade from the scene. So to some degree, the terrible circumstances that we saw George Floyd in are not mitigated, but they're explained. This whole idea of lingering effects is explained when we consider the strange case of Sergeant Crowley and his encounter with Dr. Gates, a distinguished historian at Harvard. So as you recall, in the early years of the Obama era, or you might recall, Mr. Dr. Gates was returning home to his house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, from an overseas trip. He didn't have his key and he was breaking into his own property. Sergeant Crowley saw him doing this and challenged him. Dr. Gates felt that Sergeant Crowley really didn't have any reason to do so, and therefore he played a game of hardball with him, saying, I don't have to show you ID. And then Sergeant Crowley, in a sense, upped the ante by saying, well, in that case, I'm going to arrest you. So this was this rather unpleasant exchange that took place in which the two parties decided to play very, very stubborn roles. But the really interesting thing is that this took place at a time when the mayor of Cambridge was a black African, an African American lady. The professor, the person, the aggrieved party was a distinguished professor at Harvard and was African American. The governor of Massachusetts at the time was an African American. And of course, you recognize this individual here, right? The man seated in the White House, the most powerful office in the land, was African American as well. We understand that it is possible for these old attitudes to intrude, and they're egregious when they do, but at the same time, we understand that this is becoming a diminishing signal, that this is left over from the old world, and being swallowed up by the new one. And of course, when you look at projections of the US population by race, what we see in this case over here, I'm blocking it, this is present day America, where the majority of people are still white. When you actually turn to 2050 America, you see that white non-Hispanics are actually going to be something of a minority in the country. And you just have to ask yourself, in a context like that, where you have elections, free elections, and you have people from a wide array of backgrounds voting, is it possible that the politicians who actually sit in Congress are going to be quite different from the population that sits in Congress today? And my answer to that is absolutely. We will see more members of visible minorities seated in Congress. We will see probably more women seated in Congress. And as a result, these laws, right, new laws will be passed to ensure that these lingering effects of the old regime, disturbing lingering effects, are actually ousted from the system. And I think that goes some way in explaining, or in some way mitigating, some of the negative changes that we've seen come about because of the recent gains from the 1950s into the present day. Another category in which, by which we can explain some of um, these these disparities and unpleasant effects is what I call a Hail Mary frustration. And what I mean by that is these changes have come about so quickly, so rapidly. I mean, just think of it. We're talking about the first time ever women are in the workforce replacing white men. Minorities are in the workforce replacing white men. Abortion is available, right, on demand. Contraception is available on demand, and so on and so forth. It has happened so with such remarkable speed that you have an older part of the population, for the most part, in a sense, acting in a way, a last ditch attempt to stop this change from encroaching on society as a whole. And this is what I mean by a Hail Mary frustration. So if we look at Brexit, right, we have England separating itself from the European continent, the European Union, and for the most part, the people voting were older Englishmen or older English citizens. They were the ones who were not going to avail themselves of the gains that younger people would, the ability to move to continental England, study and work there, something that excited the younger population. They weren't going to get those gains. What they saw only were the losses, the loss of the old British independence bulldog spirit, right? That notion of strong national sentiment, a national cuisine and national customs that they grew up with. They didn't like this, so they voted against this, or they voted in favor of leaving the European Union because it was more in keeping with their older and probably antiquated outlook. When we take a look at the Ukraine war, it's so interesting to see that the bulk of Putin's supporters, and this really is an initiative that is an assertion of former Soviet power, the bulk of his supporters are perhaps, let's say, 55 and older. The young population, the younger, savvy population, the ones who have not been conscripted, have left the country. Something like 1 million of them. They have left Russia because they have no interest in fighting in what they look upon as a senseless cause, a skirmish that really goes back to Soviet days, which is not part of their radar screen in the way it is part of the radar screen of the older population. And therefore, as frustrating and ugly as this Ukrainian war is, I don't see it as something that is endemic to the modern spirit. I see it as an attempt, a last attempt on the part of a former Soviet soldier to somehow stop time and go back to the old way of doing business. We could even think of Roe versus Wade along these lines. The people who are very much in favor of it tend to be older people coming from a Christian background. Right? It doesn't make it less problematic for people who would like to see this access to abortion retained. But again, it is an older population that is making this last ditch attempt to prevent this change from actually spreading further. And then there's the election of Trump. I think when you actually look at who elected them, you understand that these are people who felt that their job was at stake, that too many jobs had been sent overseas as part of the new economy. They saw too many of their jobs suffering and contracting because of a new environmental consciousness that would push the oil industry and perhaps such things as mining and coal off to one side at a cost to people who felt this means our means of making a living have now just been absolutely taken from us. new attitudes with respect to citizenship and gender expression. This too caught this older guard, unawares. And as a result, when they saw this very unconventional politician step forth saying, I'm going to bring an end to this, I think they felt that this was their last ditch or Hail Mary moment to actually prevent modernity from moving forward. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in the 2024 election and whether this type of equation can repeat itself. And even if it does repeat itself and Trump is reelected, I have an idea that vision that he's bringing to the American public's attention is a vision that can't last long, not because it's wrong, but because it's outdated. Then there's another category in which we've seen many, many changes on the global front that are very, very unpleasant, but they're not due to modernity. They're not due to the gains that we've made. They're actually due to the fact that populations are rejecting modernity. So if we're trying to understand why you have had an Iranian revolution, right, the supplantation of the Shah and the appearance of the Ayatollah Khomeini and his successor, the Ayatollah Khamenei, and the Republican Guard and whatnot, that is a refusal to abide by the principles of modernity that have been spreading so aggressively across the West. And when we think of the many wars that have been carried out in different parts of the world, in Yemen and in Iraq and in Afghanistan and Rwanda and whatnot, these are people who are not fighting for the modern cause or because of the modern cause. These are people who are fighting according to the norms of their old traditions, their old religious strictures, and their old tribal divisions. It is not modernity's fault that these people are actually fighting tooth and nail. It is in actual fact older systems that are responsible for these upsets that we've seen, right across the world since the West has embraced modern principles. There are also various changes, losses that have come about that can be reversed through legislative solutions. So, for example, income disparity. Perhaps if this is as egregious a problem as I think it is, it could be that there is some fine tuning that can take place with respect to minimum wage and taxation that would make the balance a little less terrible than it is at present. With respect to social media and the various alienation, the alienation that is caused and the various unpleasant habits that it's caused, tampering and bullying, cyberbullying and whatnot, that too perhaps can be somewhat tamed by legislative interference, right, as a way of somehow modifying these various weaknesses. Refugee crises across the world, that too can be handled through perhaps a change of legislation, somehow coming up with points of security for these people and then sending them home if they so desire once problems have settled back in the territory under dispute. Climate change too can perhaps be handled through legislative solutions. Here in Canada, of course, we've got our unpopular carbon tax that is just going to kick in very soon, building to a certain type of environmental code and the like. And homelessness too is something that can also be handled through greater funds funneled towards public shelters once various city councils have decided that this is going to be a priority. The most interesting category that explains many of these losses that we've incurred over the last 60 years that seem to outweigh the gains, right, is a category that I call relentlessness and Fermi's paradox. So what I mean by relentlessness is something that is described by George Steiner in his book, In Bluebeard's Castle. The story of Bluebeard, you might remember, is a tale of a man who marries these women who mysteriously disappear, right? Every time he marries a new young woman, he tells his wife, listen, I've got this vast castle and you can wander in every single room as freely as you wish, but there's one room you're not allowed to go into. And then he goes off on business and the woman is left on her own. And of course, what does she do? She wanders the palace and goes immediately to that room that she's not supposed to look inside. And guess what she finds? All the bodies of Bluebeard's former wives. And then, of course, she loses her life just as they did because they couldn't help but indulge their curiosity. What Steiner says of this, he uses this as an analogy. He says of us, right? Us Westerners, we open the successive doors in Bluebeard's castle because they are there, because each leads to the next by a logic of intensification, which is that of the mind's own awareness of being. To leave one door closed would be not only cowardice, but a betrayal, radical, self-mutilating of the inquisitive, probing, forward tense stance of our species. We are hunters after reality, wherever it might lead. So part of the problem here is that we just move forward, right? Move forward endlessly, endlessly following that trail of crumbs wherever they're going to lead. At the same time, another aspect of this column in which we can organize losses that really seem to be more losses than gains is this idea of Fermi's paradox. What do I mean by this? Well, Enrico Fermi, who was the pioneer of the atomic pile, he was seated at a cafe one day with other very brilliant people, and they were talking about intelligent life in the universe. They all agreed that intelligent life in the universe wasn't as rare as initially supposed, and they also thought that some of it would be sufficiently advanced that it could get in touch with us humans. So the question then was, Enrico Fermi himself said, so where are they? If that's the case, where are they? Why haven't they come and visited us? Well, perhaps alien life is too rare. So in a space as large as our universe, it's too rare for them to have encountered us. Or perhaps alien life still is too undeveloped. Perhaps it's on par with us or maybe behind us so that it can't engage in interstellar travel. Or perhaps alien life is here, it's here, only it hasn't revealed itself for its own strange reasons. But there's another possibility that is also part of the Fermi paradox, and that's something that we now call today great filter theory. Perhaps all life of sufficient intellectual capability flirts with self-destruction. Remember, Enrico Fermi and his cohort of brilliant physicists had worked on the Manhattan Project, and they had created WMDs. They now had the capacity to actually destroy the world, and the great hope was that somehow our politics would keep up with our technical capacity, but who's to say that it would? Perhaps all intelligent beings are faced with this. Once they reach a point where they've actually created technology that is sufficiently sophisticated to destroy everyone, maybe they don't have the social or political capital to actually prevent exactly that from happening. It could be there are other great filters. It could be that their own increase of their economy inevitably comes at an environmental cost, so that they, like we, are in some type of climate change crisis. Or it could be that they can't govern their social media, or their income disparity just runs rampant and they don't know how to solve it. Right? All of these are possible means of destruction. In other words, what we're really looking at is unintended consequences. When you think of Alfred Nobel, right? The famous discoverer, there he is, the famous discoverer of dynamite. What did he call this? He called it safety powder. He thought that he had come up with a safe means of actually excavating metals from deep underground, as opposed to the older methods. He thought this was going to save lives. He didn't know that this dynamite was going to be turned to villainous practices, right? And would cost millions and millions of lives within his own lifetime. That you'd have millions of young men losing their lives on the battlefield because of his invention. At the same time, the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk in 1903, when they finally took flight, and for the first time, humankind had actually defeated this element. They were actually flying. How could he possibly know that this would lead to the mass bombing of London during the Second World War? Or, of course, to the annihilation of Hiroshima when the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on that city? Then you've got income disparity. How did it come about? Well, one train of causation here is the fact in the aftermath of the Second World War, you had the GI Bill. You suddenly had huge, huge numbers of Americans who could attend university and colleges at the cost of the government. And these were people who were coming from fairly humble, poor backgrounds, who had never thought that perhaps they could end up in a post-secondary institution. They ended up there, they did very well for themselves, right? Very often the ones with a higher IQ did better than ones with a lower IQ. They married people who were much like themselves. They went on to get really great jobs for themselves. They went on to have children who in turn went to the Ivy Leagues and ended up doing very well for themselves and marrying their own kind. And then these people gradually started moving into the same neighborhoods. So that today we have this phenomena of the super zips, these zip codes where you've got people who are in the 95th percentile of education, IQ, as well as income earnings, all living together and, in a sense, depriving the rest of the country of their own talent. They cluster together. And to some degree, this has fed this income disparity, but not in a way that breaks the rules. It is just the natural consequence of that decision by the government to open up a post-secondary education to as many people as possible now as a reward for their fighting in the Second World War. You could think of the social malaise at place now, homelessness and alienation and addiction. And this has come about because we've seen the breakdown of Christianity, right? The breakdown of social strictures that once kept us rooted in place, but now gives us our freedom to move about however we see fit. You can see this as a product of our own expanded individual choices. We no longer have to do what our parents tell us to do, or local communities tell us to do, or the church tells us what to do. Instead, we can move off on our own patterns, our own trajectories, and yet we take a risk in doing so, right? So in a sense, when we look at homelessness and these social diseases, right, as horrible as they are and as urgent as it is to try and solve them, they're not coming about because of manipulation on the part of the upper echelons. They're coming about perhaps for some very good reasons. We can think of the surveillance capitalism that all of us are now suffering from. Right? The fact that we no longer have privacy, that companies like Google and Alphabet know exactly where we are and what we're thinking and what we're buying and what we want, even before we ourselves are aware of this information. And yet this has come about not just because you've got this scheming on the part of Google. It comes about because we have these very powerful search engines at our disposition. And even though we know what Google is doing, we are more than willing to trade, right? To trade our privacy for the ease and efficiency of everything that Google puts at our fingertips, right? The gain seems to be so much greater than the loss. And once again, it is an unintended consequence of having this convenience at our fingertips. We can also think of the shuttering of various retail as a product of Amazon's brilliant model. Instead of going to a store, a hardware store, to get a limited, right, a limited selection of screws and tools and the like, we can shop on Amazon and perhaps find a much wider variety at our disposal at a much cheaper price, and we can have it delivered free of charge to our door. And what's true of hardware is true of books and clothing and computer devices and so on and so forth. Who of us has not shopped at Amazon without being intensely aware of the fact that we are draining our retail of its blood, and yet still we do it because it is so convenient to do so. So once again, we see that a terrible loss of retail and the alteration of our cityscape is coming about because of a tremendous gain that all of us voluntarily buy into. And then there's climate change. Of course, there is climate change. We can't in any way downplay this as a massive, massive crisis. And no doubt you do find some type of corporate malfeasance at one point or another in the equation, and power brokers who would prefer to make profits at the cost of Mother Nature. But is that the true cause of it? If you take a look at these two graphs, the one graph is showing us global life expectancy from 1500 to 2016. And what is so clear is that from approximately, let's say, 1950, when I was young, to the present day, life expectancy has just climbed at a staggering rate. So that in 1960, if you were living in Yemen, your average life expectancy was approximately 32 to 34, and today it is 64. You have an additional 30 years of life. And the same would be true of countries like Syria and Sierra Leone and other places where life expectancy at one time was really almost marginal. And coupling this, of course, is the fact, and I should just stand out of the way of the graph here, right? We see that population has exploded since I was born in 1960. We're now talking of population, right? Population, a planet population that is close to 8 billion people, as opposed to the 3 billion that were alive when I was there. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is, would anyone say it is a bad thing that human beings live to the age of, in our case in Canada, 80 if you're male, as opposed to 64 when I was born, or in the case of Yemen, 65 as opposed to 32 when I was born. Right? Is this a bad thing that we've given people extended life and extended comfort and means of curing them of various diseases? Right? And if we say no, it's no bad thing at all, we have to understand that it means these people are going to be around for another, in my case, 13 years, and in the case of someone from Yemen, another 30 years, right? 30 years in which they have to be fed, they have to be housed, they have to have some access to electricity and clean drinking water, and so on and so forth. In other words, they're going to cost the planet. They're going to come at a cost to the environment. But is there anyone who would say, well, that's such a terrible thing that I wish we were living in a day and age where the average life expectancy was 35, or the population of the planet was 1 billion rather than 8 billion, or diseases would run rampant, or wars would come about in which you'd have huge numbers of people killed so that we wouldn't have to feed and house them all their lives. And yes, from my day and age, 1960, into the present, even though there have been many, many wars across the globe, the number of people dying from war has tumbled very, very significantly overall. Imagine the following. We have this new vaccine, Mosquirix, which has appeared on the market. It fights malaria, and it will probably save 600,000 lives. This year, each year, 600,000 lives. Can you imagine anyone saying, oh my goodness, 600,000 lives that we now have to feed and house for the foreseeable future? All those children who would have died and whom we wouldn't have to have fed and we wouldn't have to house, they're now going to be around dogging Mother Nature. We can't possibly argue in this vein. It is only a good thing that we're able to defeat a disease like mosquito. It is only a good thing that we're able to house people in greater comfort and feed them with greater security and extend our lives in peace and comfort and wealth, to the degree that we've managed to do over the last 60 years. We can't possibly bemoan this fact. The only problem being it's creating an environmental disaster, right? It is the bad things, right? It is the case that many bad things we see, many losses we've seen, are coming about for the best of reasons. That is just the law of unintended consequences. And it could be there's reason to hope. It could be that we'll turn to nuclear energy and that will have a huge effect in dampening the amount of carbon emissions we give rise to. Or we'll turn to renewables, or we'll drive electric cars and that will help, or we'll clone our meat. It could be 20 years from now, no one will be eating their meat off the bone. They'll be eating something that comes from a lab. And this means all of the methane and the environmental intrusiveness of livestock will simply disappear. In other words, the human condition is one of a vicious cycle. In order to deal with a problem that is in front of you, and that problem could go back to, right, the days of the agricultural revolution. How do you feed people, right, many people, without resorting to hunter-gathering? Well, it could be that you had to go into the mode of agriculture, but in doing so, of course, you transformed everything. You made a huge difference in the way people were going to live. There were gains and there were losses. When we actually reached the time of the Industrial Revolution, we understood that there was a huge amount we were going to lose, but there were going to be huge amounts that we gained. And in order to solve the problems of that era, we were creating greater problems for ourselves down the road, which we solved through our digital revolution, right, through the development of nuclear power, through a greater use of fossil fuels. Only, of course, that's led to many of the disparities that we see today. Every time we solve a problem, we open up a new front of problems. But that is the human condition, really our sad and glorious human condition. There isn't progress that just goes up steadily forward. We move forward and then we walk back a couple of steps, only to move forward and walk back a couple of steps. That is really a history of what it has been to be human for the last endless cycle of time. It could be, really, when you think of it, it was never written into the cards that we were going to survive as a species. Not when we were living in prehistoric times, not when we actually entered into the age of agriculture, not when we became technically adept and developed the Industrial Revolution, and not today either. We could suffer a meteor strike. It could be that our nuclear devices will end this world with a bang and not a whimper. It could be that we will have more pandemics carried on vectors through our massive public transportation jets and the like, and that will finish us. It could be we'll have a global economic meltdown. It could be Mother Earth will turn on us, and the worst nightmare scenario of the environmentalists will come to be. All of these things were always part of the risk that we had to navigate as human beings. And as a way of navigating this risk, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, we came up with solutions that solved one set of risks only to introduce us to another. So it could be that we will run into the end results of Fermi's paradox and we will collapse. But it's also possible that our endless experimentation, our endless embrace of change on multiple fronts across as broad a tract as possible, in other words, the modern spirit, the modern state of being, it will lead us to really the best of all worlds for everyone imaginable. I think we can agree at this stage that there truly has been change. In the next lecture, it will be necessary to raise a very important question. How do we judge the past?